The heavy oak door of the Department of Defense auditing room clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the busy Washington corridor. Inside, the air was sterile, smelling of ozone, fresh carpet, and the cold, unmistakable scent of bureaucracy. Thomas Vance sat in the center of the room. He was 78 years old, his frame lean and weathered like a piece of driftwood that had survived a lifetime of rough seas. He wore a faded olive-drab field jacket, its collar frayed, its brass buttons dulled by decades of quiet existence. His hands rested on his knees. They were heavily scarred hands, the knuckles thick, the skin mapped with thin white lines that told stories the government had no interest in reading. Across from him sat Bradley Hayes. At 32, Hayes was a civilian contractor hired to trim the fat from the Veteran Affairs budget. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored gray suit, a luxury watch that cost more than Thomas's yearly pension, and an expression of permanent, condescending boredom. Hayes belonged to a new generation of analysts, men who had never worn combat boots, never slept in the mud, and believed that every human life could be accurately summarized on a digital spreadsheet. Hayes tapped his expensive stylus against his tablet. The sharp, plastic clicking echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Mr. Vance," Hayes began, not bothering to look up from the glowing screen. "I am going to be completely transparent with you. You are wasting my time, and you are wasting taxpayer money." Thomas did not react. He kept his pale, faded eyes focused on the wall directly behind Hayes. "I received a letter," Thomas said, his voice carrying the deep, gravelly slow gravel of a man who rarely spoke unless it was necessary. "It said my medical coverage was being terminated." Hayes let out a short, patronizing sigh. He swiped across his tablet, pulling up a deeply redacted file. "Yes, it is being terminated. Because, frankly, your claims are absurd. You have been receiving specialized physical therapy and premium trauma care for over 30 years. And according to this new audit system, you have absolutely zero justification for it. The doctors said the shrapnel in my shoulder requires continuous management," Thomas replied softly. "Shrapnel?" Hayes laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. "Mr. Vance, I am looking at your official military service record right now. Do you know what it says?" Thomas remained silent. "It says you served from 1966 to 1970. 4 years. And your official military occupational specialty is listed as a supply and logistics clerk. You were stationed at a motor pool in Okinawa." Hayes smiled, a cruel, triumphant smirk. "You filed inventory reports, old man. You counted boots and canned beans. There is absolutely no record of you ever setting foot in a combat zone. No deployment orders to Vietnam. No combat action ribbon. No Purple Heart. Nothing." The silence in the room grew heavier. Outside the frosted glass windows, the shadows of high-ranking military personnel moved down the hallway, completely unaware of the character assassination happening inside the small auditing room. "I was where I was ordered to be," Thomas said quietly. Hayes slammed his hand flat against the table. "Don't play the stoic hero with me. I see guys like you every week. You serve a quiet, boring desk tour, then you get old, your back starts hurting, and suddenly you decide you're a war hero who deserves premium benefits. It is called stolen valor, Mr. Vance. And it makes me sick." Thomas slowly lowered his gaze to meet the young auditor's eyes. There was no anger in the old man's face. There was only a profound, exhausting sadness. It was the look of a man who had seen the darkest corners of human nature and was entirely unsurprised to find it wearing a tailored suit. "The paper says what the paper needs to say," Thomas whispered. "But my body knows where it has been." "Your body is experiencing old age," Hayes mocked, standing up from his chair. He began to pace around the table, enjoying his perceived absolute power. "You claim you have shrapnel wounds from an explosive device. You claim you have severe nerve damage from prolonged jungle exposure. I have run your file through 3 different databases. The military has no record of you ever being injured in the line of duty. Therefore, your injuries are either fabricated, or they occurred in your civilian life. Either way, the Department of Defense is no longer paying for it. Hayes walked back to his chair and tapped the screen, preparing to finalize the termination order. I am stamping your file as fraudulent. You are lucky I don't refer this to the federal prosecutor for attempting to defraud the government. Before Hayes could press the final button, the heavy oak door of the auditing room opened. It didn't just open, it was pushed with a quiet, terrifying authority. General Marcus Thorne stepped into the room. Thorne was a 4-star commander, the head of the entire Regional Oversight Committee. He was a massive man, imposing and rigid, wearing a pristine dark blue uniform heavily decorated with ribbons that spoke of true, brutal campaigns. His hair was iron gray, and his eyes were like chips of flint. He was flanked by 2 nervous-looking junior officers. Thorne was conducting a random floor inspection, auditing the auditors, ensuring that the new civilian contractors were adhering to military decorum. Hayes immediately snapped to his feet, nearly knocking over his expensive chair. His arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a panicked, desperate attempt at professionalism. General Thorne. Sir. I wasn't expecting you. I am Senior Analyst Hayes. I am just finalizing a routine fraud termination. General Thorne did not look at Hayes. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene. He saw the aggressive posture of the young man in the suit. And then, he looked at the old man sitting quietly in the center chair. Thomas had not stood up. He kept his hands resting on his knees, his back perfectly straight. A fraud termination? General Thorne asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that made the junior officers by the door stiffen. Explain. Hayes, eager to impress the 4-star general, puffed out his chest. Yes, sir. This individual, Thomas Vance, has been draining medical resources for decades claiming combat trauma. But his file clearly shows he was nothing more than a logistics clerk in Okinawa. No combat record. I caught the discrepancy, sir. I am cutting off his fraudulent claims. Thorne slowly turned his massive head toward Hayes. The general's expression was unreadable. You are calling this man a fraud? Yes, sir, Hayes said, gaining confidence. He claims he has shrapnel in his arm. It's a complete fabrication to get taxpayer money. Thomas Vance let out a slow, quiet breath. He didn't look at the general. He didn't look at Hayes. He simply reached over with his right hand, gripped the cuff of his faded olive drab jacket, and slowly began to unbutton it. What are you doing? Hayes snapped. Button your coat. Have some respect in front of the general. Thomas ignored him. He slid the heavy jacket off his left shoulder. Underneath, he wore a simple, worn gray t-shirt. He reached down and slowly rolled up the left sleeve of the shirt, pulling the fabric high over his bicep. Hayes let out a scoffing sound, preparing to mock whatever old age scar the man was about to show. But when the sleeve cleared the shoulder, the entire room went dead silent. Thomas Vance's left arm was not just scarred. It was completely ravaged. Thick, twisted lines of burned tissue and jagged, star-shaped shrapnel entry wounds covered his skin from the elbow to the shoulder. It was a terrifying testament to a violent, localized explosion. It was the undeniable geography of war. But that was not what made the air in the room turn to ice. Just above the horrific scarring, stamped into the faded, aged skin of his upper bicep, was a tattoo. It was old, the black ink having turned to a blurred, murky blue over 50 years. But the design was still clearly visible. It was a skull wearing a green beret, wrapped in barbed wire, with 3 playing cards fanned out behind it. The ace of spades, the jack of hearts, and the 8 of clubs. Beneath it, written in crude, hand-poked letters, was the phrase, "We sleep in the dirt." Hayes looked at the tattoo and sneered. What is that supposed to be? Some fake tough guy ink you got at a biker bar? General Marcus Thorne stopped breathing. The tall, imposing four-star commander froze. His flint-like eyes widened, locking onto the faded blue ink on the old man's arm. All. The color drained from the general's face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very, very old. "Sir," one of the junior officers whispered, noticing the general's shock. Thorne didn't hear him. The sterile walls of the auditing room vanished. The general was violently pulled back through 50 years of locked, classified memories. It was 1969. The deep, impenetrable jungles of Laos. A place where the United States military officially did not exist. Thorne was just a terrified 19-year-old private, pinned down in a muddy ravine by overwhelming enemy machine gun fire. His platoon had been decimated. They were bleeding out in the dark, rain pouring down in sheets, radio completely dead. They had been waiting to die. And then, out of the tree line, like ghosts stepping from the shadows, a 5-man long-range reconnaissance patrol had appeared. They wore tiger-striped camouflage with no name tapes, no rank insignia, and no unit patches. They operated in absolute, terrifying silence. Thorne remembered the leader of that ghost unit. A sergeant with cold, dead eyes and a voice like grinding stones. When Thorne had been hit in the leg and couldn't walk, that unnamed sergeant had thrown Thorne over his shoulder and carried him for 4 miles through the jungle, firing a CR-15 rifle with one hand while the enemy hunted them in the dark. Right before the medevac chopper had pulled Thorne into the sky, the sergeant had turned back to hold the landing zone. In the chaotic flash of the helicopter's strobe light, young Thorne had seen the man's left arm. A skull. Barbed wire. 3 playing cards. "We sleep in the dirt," it was the insignia of MACVSOG. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. A highly classified, black operations unit. Their casualty rate was over 100%. Their missions were so secret that when they returned home, their files were scrubbed. Officially, they were given fake records. They were listed as cooks, mechanics, and logistics clerks stationed in safe zones like Okinawa. They were men who gave their souls to their country, and in return, their country erased them from history. Thorne had spent his entire career looking for the ghost who had saved his life. He had checked every roster, pulled every string, and found nothing. Until now. General Thorne took a slow, trembling step forward. He bypassed Hayes completely. He stood in front of the small wooden chair where Thomas Vance sat. Thomas slowly rolled his sleeve back down, covering the horrific scars and the faded ink. He looked up at the general. For a brief second, a flicker of recognition passed between them. The old ghost and the young private. "Mr. Vance," Hayes barked, trying to regain control of his room. "I asked you a question about that tattoo. You are testing my patience." "Shut your mouth," General Thorne said. He didn't yell. The words came out so soft, so dangerously quiet, that the entire room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Hayes blinked, confusion washing over his arrogant face. "Excuse me, General." "Sir, I am just doing my job. This man is a clerk who—" "If you speak another word in this room," Thorne said, turning his head just enough to fix Hayes with a stare that had broken hardened terrorists, "I will have you physically thrown through that glass wall by military police. Do you understand me?" Hayes's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. He nodded, terrified into absolute silence. Thorne turned his attention back to Thomas. The 4-star general, a man who commanded fleets and armies, looked down at the old man in the frayed jacket with a reverence that bordered on holy. "Okinawa," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking with 50 years of buried emotion. 1969. Thomas looked at his scarred hands. "It rained a lot in Okinawa that year, General. Hard rain. Muddy. The code words. The confirmation of a place they had both been, a place that didn't exist on paper." A tear escaped the corner of General Thorne's eye. He didn't bother to wipe it away. He looked at the young junior officers by the door. He looked at the terrified auditor. "This man," Thorne said, his voice now booming, vibrating with absolute authority, "is the reason I am alive to wear these stars. This man operated in the darkest corners of hell so that cowards in tailored suits could sit in air-conditioned rooms and look at spreadsheets." Hayes swallowed hard, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped his tablet. "Sir, his file, it says. His file says what it had to say to protect the secrets of this nation." Thorne roared, finally letting his anger loose. The sound physically pushed Hayes back a step. "His file is blank because he gave his real life to the shadows. He bled on foreign soil so you could have a comfortable job. And you dared to call him a thief." Thorne turned to one of his junior officers. "Captain. Confiscate Mr. Hayes's security badge and his tablet. He is fired. I want him escorted off this military installation immediately. He is permanently barred from any DoD contracting. General, please." Hayes begged, his arrogance completely shattered. "I was just using the algorithm. I didn't know." "Ignorance is not an excuse for disrespect," Thorne said coldly. "Get him out of my sight." The two officers moved swiftly. They stripped the badge from Hayes's chest, took the tablet from his trembling hands, and dragged the protesting, humiliated auditor out of the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. The room was quiet again. General Thorne stood alone with Thomas Vance. The general took a deep breath, composing himself. He looked down at the tablet resting on the table, where the red, fraudulent, "Terminate" banner was still blinking next to Thomas's name. Thorne picked up the tablet. He bypassed the security protocols with his command override code. He deleted the termination order. He typed in a new authorization code, elevating Thomas Vance's medical coverage to absolute maximum priority, categorized under classified black budget healthcare. He locked the file. Then, Thorne placed the tablet gently on the table. He turned to Thomas. The old ghost was already standing up. His knees popped slightly. He adjusted his faded olive jacket. "You didn't have to do that, Marcus," Thomas said quietly, using the general's first name. Thorne shook his head. "It took me 50 years to say thank you. It's the least I could do." Thomas gave a small, slow nod. He didn't ask for praise. He didn't want a parade. He had simply wanted the medicine that kept the pain of the shadows at bay. He turned toward the door, his worn boots making soft sounds on the carpet. "Sergeant," Thorne called out. Thomas stopped. He hadn't heard that rank in a very, very long time. He turned around. General Marcus Thorne, commander of the regional forces, stood at perfect, rigid attention. He snapped his right hand up to the brim of his cover in a flawless, bone-deep salute. It was a salute held not for a superior officer, but for a legend. Thomas Vance looked at the general. For the first time all day, the profound sadness in his eyes lifted, replaced by the quiet pride of a duty fulfilled. He slowly raised his scarred, trembling hand, and returned the salute. Two men. Bound by a ghost story. Standing in the silence of a truth that no spreadsheet would ever understand.